Hi, Jaylene. Hi, Courtney.
Hello.
How are you guys doing?
Not too shabby. How have you been?
Good. Hanging in there. We finally got a really sunny day up here.
I
Where
know.
are you, Courtney, again?
I'm in Hewelton.
Oh, okay. So you're like the same weather as here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was yesterday. I was in this Zoom meeting with somebody in San Diego, and it was just making me so jealous because she was wearing a tank top and it was really hot there. And then I showed her the snow outside of our it was snowing yesterday. But
I know it was ended up getting like a whiteout when I was driving, and then like 20 minutes later it was super sunny out.
yeah, it was just for a minute, but in that minute everybody found the time to go on social media and complain about it. So that's
That's usually how it goes.
Oh, I never complain about the weather on social media because I really get so tired of people just complain. It's just like the most boring thing in the world, and it depresses everyone. So that's one of my only social media rules.
Amen.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay, so trying to remember who was here. Karina, Brandy, and Jaylene. I feel like you guys were all here on Monday, except Brandy. Maybe I'm thinking of sustainability. Were you here on Monday? I see you're not on mute, but I can't hear you. Oh, your mic isn't working. Oh, okay. Well, I won't ask you unnecessary questions then. Oh, you weren't. Okay. So I did send out the email today because I wanted to try and get more people to come to this for their own good. But we have some of the same folks, but some new people. So what I'm going to do is partially what I did on Monday. Hi, Jen. Which is so for the benefit of people who weren't here on Monday, I'm going to just go through the exam review sheet and kind of tell you the format and everything of the exam, because sometimes that raises questions in people's minds that I can answer. And then we'll go into the part where you guys can just ask me any questions you want about the points I asked you to study, and I will answer them for you. So let's get started with that. Let me share my screen. Where is it? Here it is. Okay, that seems not helpful. Can you guys see the final exam study guide, or is that not effectively shared?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so just the basics that I sent out in an email to everybody. The exam is next Tuesday, so Tuesday, May 19th, and it opens at 10:15, so you can start taking it at 10:15. You can take it any time in the next 24 hours, but it's like the same thing as the midterm. You check it out and you have 2 hours. So if for some reason you're not able to take it in those 24 hours, let me know ahead of time, and we can set something up. I had to do that for a couple people last time who had very reasonable reasons why they couldn't, but hopefully that will cover most people. So what's on the exam? So here's the big thing to remember. It's not cumulative except for 2 points. So it is the final exam, but it's covering just material since the midterm, with the exception of these 2 points that I put in green that I'm retesting because people didn't do as well as I hoped on the midterm. Some of you did great on these questions, but I want to ask about them again to make sure people get that message, that takeaway. And those points are, well, I guess we'll get to them in a minute when we get to specific points. But basically, the best way to study is to go, if you haven't already been doing this as we go along, go to the Moodle page and download all the lecture slides. Like from each week, they're up there and labeled from each day. And then attended, if you listened to all the lectures, great. If you didn't, go back and fill in those gaps. I should probably have tried to wear more outfits during this time because it's going to be hard for you to remember whether or not you saw lectures, since I'm like always wearing the same clothes and have the same background. But sorry about that. I am wearing a different shirt today. You're welcome. But you should be able to tell which lectures you haven't watched. Rewatch those lectures, look at the Moodle notes, and look at this list of topics, right? So the topics are in the order that they were covered in class. So you can like get your list, get your lecture notes, and go through the list and make sure you can answer all the questions. And if you can't answer one of the questions, look in the Moodle notes from what you're missing. And if that's not jogging your memory, look back to the taped lecture or email me and ask me. But from those sources, you should be able to get everything. The other piece is the workshops, right? So just like on the midterm, I will definitely ask questions that are like mini scenarios from the workshops, right? So I asked questions in the midterm, like a farmer has 20 acres of forest on his land and 20 acres of agriculture. Like, what ecosystem services is the forest providing him? And that's something we worked on in a workshop. So it's like, make sure you read through the workshops and you know, you understand the concepts from those. The format's the same. It's worth 100 points, right? Just like it says in the syllabus. And then approximately 20 multiple choice, approximately 20 short answer, and then 4 or 5, I think there might be 5, the way so far, questions that are those essay questions. And those questions, people tend to get worried about them, but actually those are the ones people do the best on because there's the most opportunity for partial credit, right? Okay. So that's kind of my little overall spiel on what's on the exam. Do you guys have any questions about the logistics of it? Or any questions at all that come up to you?
I have 2 questions that are on like the specific questions.
Okay. Okay, let's go ahead with those. Before we get into the specific topics, I just want to say this one thing, which is that, okay, so those first 2 are in green because like it says above, those are the 2 topics that are from before the midterm. So they're in green just to remind you, like, you're not going to, if you don't know what those are, you're not going to find them in the lectures since the midterm. You have to go back to before the midterm to look those up. Okay, so so that's just a couple comments on there, but Karina, which ones are your questions on?
I had a question on 21 and 22. I was just unsure on like how to answer those.
Oh boy, I should have numbered these instead of bullets. Could you tell me what they were?
It was give examples of creative ways people have created habitat connectivity for a range of species in urban and suburban landscapes, and then the one right after it.
Okay, so let's do the first one first. So give examples of creative ways people have created habitat connectivity for a range of species in urban and suburban landscapes. Does anyone else have an answer to that?
Is that how they like built the tunnels for the turtles under trains and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the examples. So that lecture was where we were talking about conservation in human modified landscapes. And I spent part of the week talking about conservation in agricultural landscapes, since agriculture is 40% of the Earth's surface. And then I spent a day, I think it was the Friday, talking about conservation in urban landscapes, which, you know, it's not like we're going to prioritize conservation in New York City and say, like, you know, 40% of this needs to be a park. No, but we can there's little ways that we can integrate habitat into cities that benefit humans as well as species. So one of these ways that I highlighted in that lecture was like just providing, so not all species are gonna like live in a city or in the suburbs, but many will travel through those areas. And so if you don't give them any way to travel through, like if you picture a city, a map of a city, like, I'm just thinking of Washington, D.C., because my brother lives there. If you are like looking at the map on your phone and you zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, and then you imagine you couldn't cross a road, there's like no way to get anywhere, right? As an animal skirting the city, right, on a migration route or something like that. So one of the main ways that biologists have been working in the last 30 years to maintain connectivity in through those landscapes is with like highway crossings. And so that's what Jen's talking about. And I put a couple pictures of some crazy ones in there. Like, do you remember there was that crab crossing that for crabs there's a highway on their migration route. So they put in these screens and there was like a river of crabs crawling up it and crawling across. And we have the turtles, that was for them to go under train tracks. We have a bunch around here. And does anyone know Glenn Johnson in the biology department? Professor? He's been working for years on getting turtle crossings up here in the North Country. So he works with turtles and Blanding's turtle, which is an endangered species. And he's gotten funding to install several like culverts under the road for Blanding's turtles on Route 11, which connects Canton and Potsdam. So that seems like a small project, but these are actually huge in terms of maintaining connectivity for wildlife. So for examples, you could give any example of like an underpass or an overpass for a highway. Then there were also some examples in there. Does anyone remember the other kind of interesting example that was in that lecture? What other species had a highway going through a city? Remember? It was in Sweden or Norway. It was in Norway, I think. A bee highway. So it was in Oslo. Is that in Norway? Sorry, I don't remember. It's a Nordic country, and it's a city surrounded by a lot of agriculture, but the honeybees are threatened around the world, if you guys haven't heard that. And so they decided to create bee habitat in the city so that bees could travel through the city to get to other agricultural patches. And basically the city, if you registered to have bee habitat on the roof of your building or in your yard, the city would give you a little grant to plant flowers and establish a structure and to maintain it. And so they're increasing bee populations in the city. That's really popular in New York City too, actually. It's legal in New York City to keep beehives in many parts of New York City. So just a couple of really interesting ways that cities around the world are creating habitat connectivity. Does that address that question, Karina? Okay, so has anyone ever seen one of those wildlife crossings? No? I've seen a couple, but I've never seen animals crossing them. I've seen the remote sense cameras, pictures of it. Okay, so the second one that Karina was asking about there, articulate the challenges of looking at all aspects of conservation, biological, social, and economic. Why is this difficult, and why has it not usually been done in the past? So when I read this question, a certain graphic comes in my mind right away, and it's that graphic that was from your text. Let me go get it. Oh my gosh, I turned right to it. It's, all right. Isn't that weird? Okay, let me fix that. Fun features of Zoom. Um, how do I, here we go. I'm just gonna do no virtual background so that I can show you this better. Oops. You guys still there? Yes. Okay. So can you see this image? It's in one of the lectures slides. It's in 2 of the lectures, I think. And basically what it shows, I guess I should just bring it up on the lecture, but essentially what it's showing you is, this is fun. Okay, forget it. I was trying to do something non-virtually, but it was a fail. I will get it for you somewhere else. Where is it? Okay, so here is our page, our Moodle page, and I think that was maybe the first day of people in conservation. Yes, okay, so this is from, looks like May 4th. And so essentially what this figure is showing, what I was talking about in this lecture was that, okay, so historically, well, this just leads me down, there's so many interesting things to say about this because historically, science and research was interdisciplinary. Like if you think of Aristotle and people going and asking questions in his garden, right? It's not like they were like, well, you can only ask about chemical engineering here. No, it was exploring all the knowledge about systems in the world. So that changed over time and became really split up and disciplinary. And that, in my opinion, that doesn't benefit us because what this image is showing is that like all these aspects of managing ecosystems that are really important have ended up being the purview of really different fields. So like that circle up there, here it's like, okay, there's policies and laws and companies that want to do things or regulate things a certain way, but maybe they're not considering all these aspects of human behavior. And maybe they're not considering what the ecosystems actually need. Because one of the reasons they don't get considered altogether is because these are totally different fields. Like there's people who are trained as ecologists and they might go out into a wetland and evaluate like the water quality and the species richness, right? But they're not also going around and interviewing all the people who live on the edge of the wetland. Like, what do you think about developing this wetland and what services does it provide you? And would you be willing to pay additional taxes to not develop this wetland? That might be sociologists who aren't necessarily talking to the ecologists. And then a business who maybe wants to build on the wetland is mandated by law to take some ecosystem pieces into account, but not the social pieces. That usually comes in the form of just like protests, right? So the overall point is the challenges of trying to look at an ecosystem, of trying to manage, to conserve biodiversity, it's not a single disciplinary field that can do that. It's an interdisciplinary undertaking, but it's not always approached that way. It's usually approached by like one field, right? So there's this quote that I really like from Aldo Leopold, this guy over here who's like known as the founder of wildlife biology. And he said this quote. Who wants to read that quote so we can hear someone else's voice?
I can.
Okay, thanks, Courtney.
One of the anomalies of modern ecology is that it is the creation of two groups, each of which seems barely aware of the existence of the other. The one studies the human community almost as if it was a separate entity and calls its findings sociology, economics, and history. The other studies of the planet and animal community and I can like barely see this. Community and comfortably relegates the hodgepodge or politics of the liberal arts. The inevitable future of the two lines of thought will perhaps constitute the outstanding advance of the present century.
Great, thank you. So yeah, if you think about what he's trying to say here, he's just recognizing two groups, right? The human community and the plant and animal community, and saying that these two don't connect with each other, but they both need to be taken into account to effectively conserve biodiversity. So what happens when you don't combine them, like to get back more specifically to that question, like articulate the challenges, they're not always in line, right? Like it might seem economically short-term more beneficial to log a whole forest, just clear cut it, but that's not socially or ecologically beneficial, right? So you're going to have conflicting motivations between these three fields, and you have to find like a happy medium for each of them, and that can be really challenging, right? Because they don't all necessarily want the same thing, although many times an agreement can be reached that gives everyone part of what they want, right? A good compromise, the saying is like a good compromise is one in which everyone is unhappy. Nobody got everything they wanted, but everybody got some things. Does that help a little bit? Okay. And there's more about that if you read through the rest of those slides there. Okay, let's go back to these points. Does anybody else have questions about specific points that you looked at on there?
One question just about the industrial agriculture. In the workshop itself, I think I was a little bit confused of exactly what was industrial. Like, for example, like if fertilizer was considered industrial and just some other like details. So I guess like just maybe going over what exactly is considered industrial farming and what is considered sustainable practices.
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely a topic on which I err on the side of assuming people know too much, because it's my field of research, so it's always really hard to remove yourself all the way out of it. And and we only spent like 2 lectures on it. Mm-hmm. So basically, industrial agriculture refers to, I think this was in the lecture Conservation and Human Modified Landscapes, where I was talking about agriculture for the first part of the week. And industrial agriculture basically refers to the system of agriculture that we've been using since essentially the 60s, when, like, to sum it all up, something happened called the Green Revolution. That sounds really good for the environment, right? But it is the opposite. So after World War II, we had all these factories and all these machines and all this capacity to like produce a ton of chemicals and resources, but we didn't have anything to use them for. So we decided to use them to make fertilizers and pesticides. It's a really interesting story, actually. Like a lot of the research that was done on biological weapons after World War II, they were like, oh, we have all these things that kill stuff. What are we going to do with it now? And then they were like, why don't we sell it to farmers? So that's what happened. So we developed much better more effective pesticides and herbicides, and we developed through something called the Haber-Bosch process, we can fix nitrogen from the air. So we have basically free nitrogen fertilizer. I think we talked about that last time. So essentially, we have all these free chemical, really cheap or free chemicals that we can now put on our crops. And so farmers started doing that, and that was promoted around the country and around the world. And then, so those are two aspects of agriculture becoming industrialized. So now farmers are reliant on pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers produced really far away from where they farm and brought to them by fossil fuel powered vehicles. And then farming started to become more mechanized. So now basically the farms started getting bigger and bigger, and they need more machines to run them. And what are those machines running on? Fossil fuels, right? So the whole system of agriculture transformed in that period from like the 50s and 60s, from something that was done with like a lot of family farms. Some of them were really big family farms, but to something that was like owned by large companies and operated like a factory with a ton of inputs into the soil and system to get a lot of outputs, but not a lot of consideration of whether that will be effective long term, right? So that's what industrial agriculture is. And that's where most of our food comes from now, industrial agriculture. Sustainable agriculture tries to move away from those practices and find alternatives. And so this is where we get back to those three levels. And I think someone asked about them last time. Like, the thing I keep emphasizing to people is I think they see the word sustainable agriculture and maybe think about like some hippies growing their own crops and like having a bunch of chickens on their roof in the city. But that's not, it's a spectrum, right? So anything that farmers do to change from industrial practices to more sustainable practices will make their agriculture more sustainable, right? Maybe not perfectly, but more sustainable. So any little move, like maybe you get all your farm machinery, instead of being powered by gasoline, you get biodiesel farm machinery. Or you switch from pesticides to something called integrated pest management. Like that was what was shown in the video with the farmer in Britain. Any little thing that can be done will help transition to sustainable agriculture, away from industrial agriculture. So for that point, I would say, like, I would never ask you at the level that we covered that to describe like many. I would probably say something along the lines of like, describe one. I'm not going to ask you to have like a comprehensive knowledge of all of industrial agriculture, but just to be able to come up with like one thing that's bad for biodiversity about the way that we operate agriculture now.
Okay.
Okay. Who else? Anyone else?
Do you think that we could review like last week's topic? I believe it's the last bullet on the study guide.
Yeah, is that Jaylene? I can't see who's talking.
Yes, that's me.
Hi. So explain how working with traditional ecological knowledge and land management systems can lead to better conservation and economic outcomes. Yes, for sure. So for that point, I would point you at the following lectures. I'll show them and then we can talk about them for a minute. So traditional ecological knowledge is something that we touched on way at the beginning of class, like one of the very first days. And I think I'll reorganize this next time, but in any case, then I went back to it for the last week of class to talk about people and conservation. So So I would refer you to, I'll talk about it a little now, but I'd refer you to all of the lecture notes, like the lectures from May 4th, 6th, and 8th. As you said, Jaylene, it's from the last week. So let me just go in and see where I define traditional ecological knowledge. I'll define it for you here, but basically what I was trying to say in this week was like, okay, we assume that it's always a better model for conservation of biodiversity to have no people around. Like this picture here would be a better model for conservation, but that's not always true because people have modified like most of this planet in one way or another. And if this particular place is not treasured by anybody, then it has no defenders. And conservation is very political, right? So if you have a place where there's a community that uses the resource, knows the resource, and values the resource, that resource is much more likely to be protected. Now, one place where you often have a community that knows the resource, values the resource, and wants to protect the resource is where you have indigenous people living on the land that they've lived on for thousands and thousands of years, right? Okay, so the first place I talked about this community-based conservation was on that Monday where I did that short lecture. And then you watched this video about community-based conservation in Tanzania. And essentially what that video was about, did you guys like that? I love watching I have to get one African wildlife video in sometime during the semester. But essentially that's a really good model, the WMAs in Tanzania, for saying, so just to sum up that video, if you haven't had a chance to watch it, essentially at first they were like, let's draw a line around this area and make it a park. And then everyone outside the park has to stay out of it and not use the resources and leave the wildlife alone. But then the people who lived around it weren't getting financial benefits, and the wildlife was like reproducing in the park and coming out and trampling their farms. And then they get in trouble if they killed them. So they totally redid that to make the communities have a stake. They developed ecotourism projects, and then the communities were employed in ecotourism. And that way they wanted the wildlife to be successful and to be there because they benefited from it financially, right? And they didn't talk about this a lot in this one, but those people have lived there for many, many years, right? So they also had knowledge about how to manage those species that was taken into account. So the idea of traditional ecological knowledge and its role in conservation is like that for many years we didn't incorporate, when I say we, I mean like Western conservation biology. We didn't think about like, oh, I'm studying this region and I want to find out how many bats there are and what their ecology is. So like, I just have to do that all from scratch because there's no published study on it. Well, now we would think like, how about I go and interview the people who have lived there for many, many years to see what they know about it, because they have traditional knowledge that can, be a foundation for learning more. So the second example of that week was the Solomon Island example that we worked on in the workshop and then talked about on Friday. And in that workshop, it really focused on this last point. How can working with traditional ecological knowledge and land management systems lead to better conservation and economic outcomes? So, do you guys remember this? Hopefully this is last week. We were talking about biocultural diversity and then talking about the Solomon Islands, and this is the slide I'm looking for. So in the Solomon Islands, people have lived off the land for thousands of years, and they don't own the land the way that we think of in Western culture. They had customary rights to the land, and so that worked well for many, many, many years. But when the area became westernized, all these logging companies were coming in and saying, "Hey, who owns this patch of land? I'd like to pay you to cut the logs down." And so then there'd always be like one jerk in the community who was like, yeah, I own it, sure. And then would sell the rights. And through that process of selling the rights, the timber company would be like, hey, we'll help you get the deed to that land. Like, I know you don't have it, but we'll pull some strings because we have money. And so ultimately it would be like, all you needed is one jerk in your community, and there's always one, to sell you all out. So that system, like imposing the Western system on that land, wasn't working for anyone but that one guy who sold out, right? Nobody else got any economic benefits and their land was destroyed. And it wasn't working for conservation. It worked for the timber companies, but even then it's like only once and then there's no more timber. So what they changed there was working with these community-based conservation programs that essentially gave the power back to the people through their traditional land management systems. I don't have a picture there from the workshop, but so so that it gave them a different path so that whole communities could be like, whoa, everyone's formalizing in a Western sense their ownership of the land. Can you help us do that too? And then we'll own our land and then we'll manage it in our traditional ways. And when we sell logs, everyone will get a piece of the money. But we won't be motivated to clear cut the whole forest because nobody will get anything after this year, right? And so with that community management system in place, they've been able to have better conservation in some of these areas. And then so that's an example of just how their traditional land management systems can be leveraged to help with conservation, right? But there were also a couple examples in there of like, okay, they know a lot about how to manage individual species because they've been relying on them for food for many years. Did that help, Jaylene?
Yes, it did.
Okay. So in a nutshell, I would say like instead of fighting against traditional ownership of lands to establish conservation reserves, the better idea is to work with traditional landowners to figure out what they know, what they think would work, and how they want to protect that land. Because they're the most bought in stakeholders of anybody, right? Okay. What else? Any other questions? I think we have a couple minutes left. It's going to tell me. Oh, we only have 2 minutes left. So let me just say in these last 2 minutes, if we're going to meet again on Friday, and it's just a wrap up of the class. I hope people will come. I'll record it just like I record these and I'll post it, but it'll just be a quick wrap up, but we can also take a couple minutes then if people have questions between now and then. You can ask me on Friday as well. So we'll do like the first 15 minutes of class for questions, and then, or maybe the first 15 minutes will be wrap up and then questions. So I hope that sounds good. Thank you for tuning in today. And if you haven't had a chance to look at that whole list, do it now and come back on Friday to ask your questions. Okay, thank you guys.
Do you have a second?
Yeah. Courtney,
All right, so
this will turn off, but can I send you a new Zoom link and we can connect?
yeah, sure.
Okay, let me do that right now.
Okay.
I'll email it to you right now.